soon. I'm delighted to introduce our two speakers today. Ours is Thomas Eggerer, whose first solo show in the UK is opening tomorrow at Maureen Paley. Thomas's work has been shown extensively worldwide. And David Joselit, lecturer and professor at Yale University, critic, and also currently an editor of October. So the idea is, just wanted to say that David has just come off a plane to join us today, so we're particularly grateful. Thanks very much. The idea is Thomas will look at his work, give a short presentation, and then both will have a conversation, and we'll open up for questions from you after that. So thank you again for coming. Thank you to our speakers, and I'll hand over to Thomas.
Okay. Well, this talk will focus on one show. It is not my most recent one, but it will give you a solid introduction into my work. And if I should, I have the habit of not speaking very loud, unfortunately, so louder right away. Okay. The show was at Buchholz Gallery in Berlin in 2010, and it was titled France Romance. A somewhat disruptive installation, as you can see in these shots. It didn't offer one type of image, but was rather seeking to generate a dialogue between collages, drawings, paintings, representational and non-representational. Oops, that's already very quick. I wanted to show these collages at the beginning because they will give you an impression of the types of pictures I'm looking at. Most of my work starts with a found image that I collect on impulse. Sense comes after the fact, and I try not to think in a discursive manner when I look through magazines, books, or any type of printed matter, or the internet, which is becoming a more important source. All that stuff in these collages is culled from sources that I come across, and of course I have preferences. Most works will be figurative. These are small-scale magazine page size, rather intimate. One thing that interests me in doing collages is that I take the matter-of-factness of the photographic image and fold it into a spatial or formal context that is entirely artificial. We will see later on how that carries over to my paintings and to the question of the relationship of the subject matter and form at large. The engagement with the gaze of the viewer is a very important aspect in all of my work. In most collages, there is a sense of exposure of the figure or the body parts on display, which puts a voyeuristic spin to the gaze of the viewer. This voyeurism plays out in a more complicated way in the paintings. This is the cover of a book on Japanese display design that I found in the basement of my apartment building. I just want to, for once, run you through the whole process of making an image in my work. Or I should say, making a painting in my work. There were various finds in this book, but most importantly, I found this image of women gazing into a public aquarium. What exactly was it that made this image so attractive to me? I think my attraction had to do with the space itself, its claustrophobic vibe, heightened by the water mass, the paradoxical interplay of transparency and opacity. Transparency plays a major role in the spatial logic of my work. Transparency is identified with democracy, accessibility, and equality in the rhetoric of modernist architecture. Or was it the tiling of the floor that caught my attention? Its grid-like structure, the imagined pastel paleness of the color versus the entropic presence of the unquantifiable water mass. Or was my interest triggered by the oddly festive retro 80s outfits of these big hair ladies that seem so out of place at this public space, which is most likely a private commercial space, like almost all contemporary space? The investigation of these questions begins with a drawing. This is acrylic on paper, and it's fairly large size. It's maybe like 6 feet wide, and this format of projection stretches everything a bit. I have a feeling how it kind of compresses it. In these drawings, I try to figure out a format. I usually do many drawings like that, and most of them will be disposed of, like for instance this one. But some do survive and end up an exhibited piece. What I learned from this drawing is that the ladies didn't work for me. They turned out to be too static, and the one in the center here blocks any kind of dynamic tension of empty space versus more populated shortening of space. So the question is how to find the right kind of figures for choreography that is best responding to the particularities of my impression of this space. And this is some of the material that I ended up using. I mean, the way it works is I have boxes in my studio where I have just, like, I collect things over time, you know, and sometimes these clips, they sit in there for years and I don't ever use them, but eventually, you know, some of them will be put to use. And the clippings can be tiny at times, and the information with regard to facial expression insufficient. I mean, this is a very, very small clipping. It's much smaller than on the photo, actually. It's like only really this size. I also end up inventing figures of body parts, because I absolutely don't know how big a figure should be and where it should be best placed. I make cutouts that I move all over the space, just to see what looks good. But I turn out to be wrong. Nonetheless, most of the time. And the painting sometimes is evidence of this constant repositioning via a try and error search. This is the first version of this painting, and it's a good example. The figures are transparent, ghost-like mirages in a space that seems to be very much on the move itself. This is, again, this is all a little bit distorted. I mean, that's actually really how it looks. So this is a stretched version of that painting. This is called Friday's Child, and it's obviously building on the findings of the previous painting. I think I would start by saying that it's hard to tell what is really going on in this painting. I mean, what exactly are some of the figures looking at while others seem to be looking elsewhere? What are they doing in that space? All these questions don't really interest me much, besides my desire to not offer any complete answers. What is more important to me is that they act out particular movements, always echoing the specific features and dimensions of the space around them. I see figures, and yet I have the feeling of a loosely connected web of distinctly articulated body parts, which could be rearranged to build a different body. I mean, this foot here could possibly belong to this person or to that person. There is a certain imagined possibility of interchange. And of course, the fact that they wear uniforms strengthens the sense of modular mutability, which is what I'm aiming for. I want to avoid a static tableau and insist on potential interchangeability. The stain, if you want to call it a stain, is roughly semicircular, mapping out the space like in a geometrical drawing, concave extension and linear endlessness. The girl is almost in the center and looks upward, sort of measuring for us the potential vertical extension of the space, ready to take off like a rocket. I think there's a sense of precariousness in the way these figures are placed, sort of marking out his or her own territory next to each other. Some figures seem very exposed to various glances, including the viewer's gaze. The viewer is partaking in a regime of glances inside and outside of the painting. He or she is not a neutral connoisseur, but is rather pushed into a position of voyeuristic supervision, and thus partaking in the overall atmosphere of mutual control in this painting. And yet I want to point out that the figures are not victims of our gazes or helplessly exposed to this arena of surveillance. I have the feeling that the girl is an absolute authority in performing this movement in this space. Like a ballerina, she knows how to master any spatial challenge, and her wisdom is unassailable. I call this a second version, assuming there could be other versions. I'm not into the idea of this being the final masterpiece or working towards the ultimate wisdom around a given material. This is an ad for a Swiss watch. And I quote here from the text on that ad. Unlock and conquer, Admiral's Cup Challenge 44 steel. The signature nautical flags identify the ultimate timepiece that releases the extreme sportsman within. I was very attracted by this sense of male leadership, braving the waves, and the female companion is obviously admiring him while guarding the entrance to the cabin. But of course not everybody can own such a vessel. I was also curious about the interior of the boat, again like in the previous painting, an interior under the waterline, or the tension between the openness of the sail being all solid material and the fabric surface catching the wind against the ephemeral transparency of the sky. I was remembering the many fascinating paintings with sailboats and other vessels braving the open waters, particularly in 19th century American paintings by Winslow Homer or Charles Kelly Bingham. This is Bingham's well-known fur traders descending the Missouri from 1845. I liked the matter-of-fact display in this painting. The gender situation is somewhat unclear. As it is offered to the viewer, it evolves along this horizontal line, almost like in a timeline. I mean the horizontal of the boat, of course. There's an animal, supposedly that's a bear, not a cat. Then a somewhat effeminate person. You can't really see it. Does anybody know this painting at all? Do you know it? No. It's in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. Okay. Then a somewhat effeminate person, where we can really only speculate on his or her gender. And here's the man at the end of this evolution, the bearded male hunter, complete with a smoking pipe. This is the frontier, and its particular ambivalent status between wilderness and civilization seems to be echoed by the unstable gender construction. There's another painting by Bingham. It's a weird title, I don't really understand it. Lighter, relieving the steamboat aground. Lighter is maybe a person who does something to relieve a boat. From 1846. Kind of unclear what's going on here, but the standing guy with the red pants seems to occupy the center of attention. While everybody stares at him, we can only see his back. In this drawing, my drawing, the lady has disappeared, and the deep blue is sort of ominous and stern. I decided to go with a brighter palette for the painting, which is called Regatta. It is a rather all-male affair, like many of Bingham's paintings, with the dark sea cutting into the yellow sky. I guess the release of the extreme sportsman within doesn't really happen in this painting. There is rather an absence of purpose, as if this was altogether a pointless exercise. Again, this is more an assembly of body parts, or figures in various phases of emergent or disintegration, than a satisfying representation of full-bodied figures. I like how the white eats into it from underneath. It also seems to erode the sense of placement of the boat. Its position in the surrounding water is unclear, thus further destabilizing and unbalancing its tilted body. Curiously, the tilted surface became a recurring theme in this show. This painting is called Fence Romance. Here the sail is replaced by a more permeable membrane. The fence could not catch the wind, nor could it totally block the view, but it is an obstacle dividing the space. The source material is a photo of the border fence along the Rio Grande separating Texas from Mexico. And I have inserted these embracing figures. A rare moment in my paintings that I would allow figures to have direct body contact. I was attracted by the ambivalence of this gesture. It is an embrace, but there's a lot of tension in it, sort of mirroring the tension inherent in the fence. Someone said it looks like Adam and Steve expelled from paradise. I think this space does have a double nature, like day and night or heaven and hell. It appears to be a realistic perspective space. At the same time, it seems in a constant rotation around the center point, with segments of the painting mirrored like in a Robert Smithson-like duplication. The realistic parts seem to give birth to parallel structures that appear to suggest alternative positions. Altogether, however, the perception is very described by the drawing, and the eye is almost commanded to take in the painting along prescribed paths. It's as if the aspect of control, which was an aspect of the figurative drama of Friday's Child, has become an intrinsic part of the experience of viewing this painting. Here is rather the authoritarian structure of the painting itself that seems to attempt to direct and control the viewer's gaze. I made another version which is much larger and which is titled The Rules of the Fence. I mean, this is a painting that is, God, it's pretty, it's maybe 8 feet wide and maybe 6.5 feet high, something like that. This painting proposes a different scenario in terms of freedom and constraint. There are more figures in the river, treating the rather abstract color bands as if they were realistic elements to be trusted as signifiers. I really liked the embracing guys a lot and wanted to make a more focused version of this motif. There's a drawing with a Blakean invocation of eternal light. The painting here is again green. When I start working on a painting, all color options on the table. Warm colors like browns, oranges, or reds tend to bring up bodily or psychological associations, which I find confining and not helpful in my attempts to curb narrativity. This green, however, has an industrial, sort of ready-made artificiality that seems to go against the empathy of the subject matter at hand. I hope this is not too boring for you because I cannot do it freely. I would lose every trace of what I want to say. So I have to write it down and read it out. Sorry. There's another painting in which I prefer the relative neutrality of green. It's called Thyrsis. Thyrsis is a flute-playing shepherd in Greco-Roman mythology. I was interested in the tension of his gesture versus the open space in which he releases his breath through the flute. A similar tension of holding and releasing, of time passing, is playing out in this abstract painting. In 2007, I started working on a group of paintings that had a different relationship to representation. I wanted to make paintings that were not derived from any media source. I'm not calling these paintings non-representational. Their shape is actually derived from a letter. The letter M, the 13th letter of the alphabet, is turned 90 degrees. I'm zooming in on a segment of the letter. The letter shape is interesting to me because it maps out and traverses the picture plane in a different way than my figurative paintings. However, it allows me to maintain their basic concerns. A modular figure in space that is both constricting and expansive. During a recent studio visit, a friend of mine said something rather curious. She said, that she thought my non-representational paintings to be more emotional than my figurative ones. I'm very attracted to this idea of something non-representational having an emotional charge, whereas I'd like to think my figurative paintings as being devoid of emotion. Even the most ecstatic moment should register more like an in vitro exercise than the expression of a feeling or a psychological state of mind. Thank you. Do you want to look at something specific? Maybe?
Why don't we look at Friday's Child first?
Okay.
And though it may not be the best example of what I want. Let's look at the second version of the fence. I forgot the title for now. Because I want to ask you a sort of, well, first of all, something, we should say that Thomas and I have had a long debate about his work, and I've known his work for, about 10 years, and I've written about it several times. So this is part of just a longer conversation that we've had over time, really. And I've discovered something, I think, today about the letter paintings, which I'll say in a minute. But I think what really struck me about what you said is that the instability of various components that are represented in the work is so important. And I was trying to kind of map it out because that's what I like to do. And it seems that there's an instability of the space, which is done largely through a kind of confrontation of abstraction, or I would say non-objective techniques and figurative ones, but we can say abstract if you want.
Yeah.
But then there's the instability of the figure, which you describe as a modular assemblage of elements as opposed to a kind of unified body. But then there's a third instability, which you didn't mention, but I think is very fundamental to your work, which is the kind of anomy or lack of connection of the groups in the paintings, which to me is super important and links to the kind of dispersion of the body through the organ, the kind of organ concept that you talked about, or did you use the term organ? The element of the body, the limb, or I was thinking of it in my own mind as what you were saying is the figure is a kind of assemblage of limbs or organs. Limbs probably a better term. And then the space is this assemblage of the figurative and the non-objective. But in a way, what I've always found the most evocative and kind of powerful about these works, if I had to choose one element, is how the groups themselves refuse to cohere. They seem often, even in Friday's Child, it seems like, okay, it's a school group, but then one of them's kind of wandering off, and that girl in the middle certainly doesn't look like she's in the same mental space. So, I mean, I think about Hart and Negri a little, which is sort of a cliche, I suppose, but is this group a multitude? Well, not really, because they don't seem unified by a kind of biopolitical drive, let's say, or will to something. Are they a community? Not really either. And are they a public? Certainly not.
I think it's rather the tensions or the possibility of all these things that is a question, and as a question it's more interesting to me than if I would state it, you know.
Right.
I think it's always the paradoxical tension towards something that you recognize as, you know, signifying something, and that coincides with what's really happening in the painting formally, an architecture that never seems to be quite what it seems to represent. Right. There's always the shadow of a rhetoric, or maybe even a failed rhetoric of something.
Right.
You know, and I think that the groups and the composition or the decomposition of a group moment is about that as well, you know.
Because I know that you're really interested in these being not self-consciously, yes, but assertively social spaces.
Yeah.
And so the group seems to me super important on that level, because it's really about the failure to make the space social.
Exactly. That's sort of it, I mean, failure is already very, puts a big judgment on it. I wouldn't even go so far.
Okay.
It doesn't constitute, and it has to fail to really satisfyingly constitute that. And as much as almost everything in that painting seems to sort of really fail in a way.
Right.
It fails to represent 100%. And yet, it's very important that on a formal level, things do cohere. I mean, I'm not making paintings that fall apart or something like that. They have to be stable as paintings, But in terms of really kind of giving you this idea that, this is what this work is about, I mean, of course, a lot of what I'm doing, I've mentioned that, is kind of trying to avoid narrativity, and a part of that will be trying to avoid giving the viewer the sense that, this is that. This is representative of that and that. This is not work happening for me, and that's the big major part of working on this painting, is avoiding that and just trying to find this point. It's a very small little point where these things don't cohere in the most satisfying way. Because if you kind of if it was a kind of very satisfying representation of full body figures, here you have it. You have it. It's all affirmative. And if I try to achieve anything in my work, it's to be non-affirmative. I want to be not affirmative on anything at all. And yet, I'm very specific in terms of what I show. That even goes down to details such as the shoes, the slippers. It's the sort of Prada slipper that everybody recognizes. The uniform itself, I have very, very strong signifying parts in something that doesn't really match up in the signification at all. What's very important in this painting, for instance, is the shoe of the, what is it called? The guy there, the steersman, or what is it called?
Helmsman.
The helmsman. It's exactly that type of sailing shoe that you expect to see. That's the proper outfit on such a boat, as if I would know, but it seems like it. But that's where I think I totally love detail and giving you that. On the whole, however, this is not what I'm interested in.
But I think that specificity, and I take your point absolutely about failure, because I agree that, it flew out of my mouth too easily and glibly. But it is absolutely not about failure, but it's about that potential held in suspension. So I agree with you on that. And that's what makes them interesting, because failure, too, is an accomplished act.
Yes. Failure, too, would be affirmative. That would be, again, leading to this narrative of failure, which is not what I'm interested in.
But I think what you're just saying now is super important, because I think the longer, especially when you know these paintings as I do, and I hope all of you will soon, if you don't already, there's a way in which a detail like that shoe is a kind of vivid stake in the ground, as it were, or a kind of anchor point, which I think is a fascinating reading on this kind of amorphous social potentiality, because, this might sound a little vulgar, but, in a kind of context of consumer fetishism, it's precisely the things that are going to be really vivid, whereas the social relations seem to have this kind of fade a little. And one of the things that Thomas does that is super interesting, and again very difficult to see in slides, is that what he did mention about the lower part of the surf here and the boat both being white, is that there are these ways in which the painting gives you vertigo by, in fact, emptying itself out. It's almost as though the very heavy and acid orange and purple is standing on absolutely nothing, but open air. And yet this is water, we know from the motif, that's holding up and that is full of waves. And so there's a super strong kind of torque in the work as well that accomplishes this on a visual level. But what I did want to sort of say, since I was proud of myself, since I had a little revelation while you were talking, is that I think that the alphabet or the letter-derived paintings are very interesting because, like these different ways in which you try to think the modular, the figure, the group, the space, the letter, of course, is absolutely a kind of the module.
Yes.
I mean, a letter is the necessary but not sufficient component of signification.
Yes.
And so it actually makes came into focus for me in the context of the rest of your work, as you were discussing.
Yeah, I mean, two things. First of all, I've made now 2 shows of only letter paintings without any representational painting components at all. Secondly, it is the modular aspect of it, that the non-compositional in a way that interests me, but also, of course, there is always anthropomorphic overtones if you want, It's like as if you are zooming in on a knee or something like that. And there is a certain tension in these paintings, And the tension plays out very different than in the figurative paintings that's also there. I mean, I had prepared a different talk where I would talk more about these paintings, but then David agreed to talk to me. And it's in these other paintings, it's really much more about the tension held in corners. So almost the impression that this element could swing out at any moment, and it could just be a totally different thing, and a different object. And I think for me it's important to think of these letter parts as objects, sort of, not just being graphic interventions. And at least for my emotional response to it, it needs to be that way.
Yeah, I mean, and it makes a lot of sense to me that given what you're doing with figures and the other genre, let's say, or other practice that you engage in, that the letter needs to be both, a kind of immaterial sign that's recognized, but also something with a real matter, and also something with, I'm interested by the remark you just made, that the corner creates this kind of disequilibrium, instability, thank you, and off-balance quality that then gives you a whole other spin on the letter. So, I mean, you're really doing for the letter, in a way, what you're doing for the figure in the other works.
That is true.
It always strikes me that you don't talk about color so much, and yet you did say some really interesting things about color today, about colors that don't have a figurative index, but I feel like your colors are so powerful and really they hit a key between the sweet and the sour, the really kind of nasty sweet that has a certain commercial quality, but then these are off, as they say on certain TV shows, they're off trend. They're not like the trendy sweet sour.
Yeah, that would be, of course.
Yeah. So say more about your color.
First of all, I want to say, with figures, what I try to find is a painting that is not warm to begin with. That relates again to it, to the presence of possible organic or related to the body somehow. The warmness always creates mood, and the mood often translates into apocalypse or hell or something like that, which would be again affirmative in some ways, answering things rather than keeping them open. So, and this painting is a good example. It isn't really warm. It's also not cold. It's just in between, and that's very important because again, with color can drive social narrativity, and that's something that I use. In a show, and you'll see that tomorrow, at least in the big space, I try to really show all the colors on the color circle. Color is totally important to me, and for me, color has, of course, a psychological weight, which you have to use and be aware of. So you can, as we've discussed before, you can really steer the atmosphere. You don't want it to be hell, you don't want it to be heaven. It can be the bittersweet, but it shouldn't be that obvious either. I'm not going into like a Peter Saul kind of territory which sells its acidity way too easily. I'm altogether trying to do something very different with the figure. This is not social satire or something. And my sense of humor is accordingly, I think it's there, but it's not so, it's not so, it can't give itself away so easily.
Now, well, as we've discussed in many, together in our own dialogue over many years, when you start to look at these paintings and really think about them, there's a lot of humor in these figures encoded in things as, I don't know if you agree, Thomas, but this hairdo, which is just a braid, but the longer you look at it, the more it looks like some kind of rat tail on top of her, and then the posture is very strange. There's something, the posture of these figures is always uneasy or unnatural, let's say. But it's just at that edge where they look completely plausible if you look at them quickly. But if you pause to look at them a little bit longer, they begin to be extremely weird. And that also distinguishes them from all of the other ones, like that little girl in the center, which is very much easier to see the strangeness of her posture, her kind of gesturing toward some sort of ecstasy, some sort of posture of ecstasy. Would you be up for talking at all about the homoerotic dimension of some of the work? Especially some of the motifs that you, well, the two men in that embrace, which you don't know if it's like a bro hug or if it's,
I mean, I like men, okay. So, what to say now?
But I mean, you could also think of it as homosexual. I certainly don't mean it as a biographical film, but as a...
I don't think so. I mean, I liked that this would be so obvious. I like that about that. It's very different. I'm not sure it's a tender gesture. For me, there is a lot of, one doesn't really know, does the other one really want to do it or not, or whatever.
Do you have an image of the motif from the, Thomas had a show with Rebecca Quaitman in New York when was it, 2 months ago or something? And there was a very interesting motif that was generated of a man at a piano who was reflected in the, you describe it because I'll...
Yeah, well, I mean, you don't know it, but if you come to see the show...
Oh, it's in the show, okay. Well, do you want to say something about it as a preview, or
yes,
we can move
I mean,
on?
The male is often, it's actually a good way to talk about it, okay? I mean, here is an authority figure on the upper left. He is necessarily a man in my world, he has a certain place in the painting where I find his body gesture here is the language of male authority, but, and Deleuze, Guattari, they write about that in the Plateau, how the body language of the child undermines the body language of, grown up. I often make use of that, And of course, consider that I'm also in advertisement and elsewhere, your voyeurism, there is a pedophile aspect sort of there, that is concealed, of course, but I'm forcing you to look at this figure as an object, of course, and her body is a commodity, and the space is a commodity, and that's an aspect also,
Yeah, well, the use of children, that does make perfect sense, because obviously children makes strange the world of adult interaction
Yes.
in a way analogous to how you're making strange the figure, the space, etc. So it's another
I think I
dimension.
propose also a reversal of authority, sort of, like this girl is the center of the painting. She's the most powerful figure in the painting. She holds the space, sort of, because after all, this is a weird, it's not at all like, how do you say, an equally divided space, but there is something of a water glass that is half full or half empty in this space. It seems to pivot around this girl to some extent. And I've said that I give her authority. What makes the figures look so weird sometimes, that I just treat them as formal entities. This is a formal little pyramid, like a triangle. Of course, all of painting history, if you look at it, is a lot like that. When you look at a Raphael painting like I did yesterday in the National Gallery, it's a very complex interaction of things, and it becomes this very interesting pyramid where you don't really know exactly how it works, because it's not really exactly a pyramid. There's a foot sticking out, and that just makes it. So things like that do interest me, of course, but I just treat them as something that has to formally cohere to what the space around it asks for. And it's a very hard way to talk about. Actually, I just don't have many answers sometimes, because I think I've said a lot now, but certain things are also beyond me to put into words.
Yeah, well, they're ineffable.
Yeah. So
I wonder, we were going to open to questions to the audience, but I want to ask you one last, if you would just think a little bit about the collages and how, because I know you think of them, well, I wondered, have they gone from tools for tools of composition to now they're absolutely autonomous? Has your attitude toward them shifted, and what do they do that the paintings can't do?
I think they can be, because I don't really have I choose them. The motives, they can be more sexual, if anything, for instance. They set up a tone. Recently they've become much bigger. This is all magazine page size, but now they are like this size more. I find they guide me in terms of an even ever more artificial space. I may not have arrived at these paintings had I not done experiments, but for me it's just another way of image making. This is actually a good example, because it also has funny elements that would even show up in the painting. I mean, there is a sort of a funny, a broken armament around it. There are angles. This is all happening because I have a formal idea around how to represent the space, and it's hard to describe. It's also very much about color. This takes me forever to figure this out, I really like this boy and this sheep a lot, for many reasons, and that's what turns me on initially. I find something that I really, really like very, very much. So we'll see where that leads me, And I find it has been useful for me in the past to have a collage next to a painting, just by destabilizing this idea that I'm a painter and I will do that. And I will also give a collage the same space as a painting, or reverse something, reverse the usual assumptions around, the hierarchies of things, where the painting is always on the top, sort of. But I found maybe, and that is very visible in this show in Berlin, but I found that I'd rather right now not want to do that. I'd rather do something where it's really only paintings or drawings or collages, because I feel I've exhausted this disruptive thing a bit, and sometimes it feels a bit, I don't know, it depends on the space also, it really does.
So are there any questions from any of you? Yes.
Can I ask you two specific questions? Because I see that some increasing interest in sort of Japanese design or culture among Western artists.
Mm.
And why are you interested in sort sort of Japanese design in a book? And also, can I ask you 2 questions?
I'm not at all interested in it.
Pardon?
I'm really not interested in
Okay.
it. No.
But
I
you're showing
just
the
found
for
this.
the book.
I found this book, and I
Yeah.
look at the book like as anything I come across, and I
But you're
found
talking
this.
about it.
Yeah, it was just a real good photo for my purposes. It could have
Okay.
been in Czechoslovakia as well. I wouldn't care. You know, I'm interested in design, but not specifically in Japanese design. You know.
Okay. Right. What do you think? Because I've been to Frieze and everything, and I see that there's a little Japanese culture influence.
Uh-huh.
Yes.
Well,
Did
it's
you
not
see
something.
that, or you don't see
No,
it?
I didn't.
No?
I didn't see. Well, what I see is, I mean, I don't know if I can give a very interesting answer to this, but it seems to me that architects like Tadeo Ando and a certain kind of
Ando.
yeah,
Yeah.
highly crafted, a form of modernism where craft is retained, but not in that kind of old-fashioned artisanal sense, but in the kind of production of incredibly beautiful, well-detailed spaces that that are modern. I mean, I think that's what in the United States, for instance, which is all I can speak to, I think people are very interested in that. But then, there's the whole fascination with digital, Japanese digital culture, which is probably more widespread among younger artists, and Murakami being a model of how one can sort of create. I mean, he's like the Damien Hirst of Japan, right? So Americans are interested in, I suppose, those kinds of practices.
So you see sort of you see sort of Japanese design as sort of modern in a way, right?
Yeah, I don't feel like I'm on. I think I've given you all I can give you on that subject, and probably more than I should have, because I really don't feel like I have any real purchase on that question.
Right.
Sorry.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
I don't know if you said before I arrived, but why do you explore so much one particular composition or one part of a painting? Is it you want to discover new things, or is it just you are sure of what you got the first time? Or it's what's behind? What I notice is that the elements are kind of polished and they become more abstract elements. So maybe that's what you're looking for through the process of using elements or compositions again over a few times.
I think there's just things that I want to see, I want to try. Hold on. Like in this painting, if you see this painting, how the white parts sit on the wall, it's almost as if the other parts become sort of a web attached to the wall. The painting in some parts disappears into the wall. And I just wanted to see it again with a very different kind of vibe, sort of, with a different interaction with the eye, That's all. I also think, like here, what happens here is this is a slightly more horizontal format to begin with. So
Yeah,
the
they
format
completely
is
changed,
when
but
it
somehow
changes, and there is more figures in this water, so there is a horizontal tension. And I was curious to see that. It's all curiosity, I don't know it, and I'm just asking myself, like here. Okay, here is a weird white band in the center, and the kind of figures, the skin tone of the figures sort of interacts with this white band, and they stand on this dark surface. And here's the reverse.
Yes, of course.
I
very
wanted to
different.
see it. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just curiosity, But there's things that I kind of find out in the way of working on a painting, and then it's just gone.
Well, what's interesting about the question too, and your answer is that it presumes that when you make a figurative painting, there's a kind of authenticity to it that doesn't lend itself to serialization. Maybe, but whereas some kinds of painterly practices are constantly making serial versions, including figurative ones.
I mean, the researches for each artist would go in a different way.
Right,
And
right.
it just
You want to know
surprised
his
me
answer.
how compositions change a lot, but somehow there is these few elements that continue, and you know. it's
I like
interesting.
also, almost the similarity of things, It's interesting to see small and subtle shifts, and how they register. That's also interesting to me. I could just say I'm painting for 5 times the same one, and how does that change? Because there's always something different. It's always different.
Yes, and then go ahead.
I was interested, David, in the way you brought up the idea of the multitude, the public, the community, to do with the figures within the paintings, and whether it's something I've always noticed in Thomas's paintings, that choreography of figures, but that they're isolated at the same time. I was wondering how you relate that depiction within the frame of the painting to your own writing about painting in networks, or if you do at all. I mean, they're almost things in opposition, but...
How I relate that to the specific multitude question, or how they are rooted in the painting.
I guess the question is depictions of figures in sort of implied communities, but they're also very isolated.
Yeah.
And the idea of the network of communication that you've related to the status of painting.
Right. I mean, I think that what I've tried to think about in that work that I've done about networks in painting is that corresponds to a painterly practice which is self-consciously thinking of its products as already part of a network which has to be brought into it in some way. And I think I do think that how Thomas uses the motif, how the motif migrates from place to place and also migrates from format to format, collage drawing, and painting. But in a sense, gesture outside the painting to say that I'm in relationship to a motif, while thematizing all kinds of external relationships as well. So to me, the motif in a way is the sort of, how shall I say, the umbilical cord to the world, which is very important, actually, I think. And I've been thinking a lot lately about how pictures become scores, how you play a picture. And I think that that's, he's one of those artists who does that. So I guess I would relate it in that way. I hope that answers that sort of.
It would, but I'd be intrigued to hear more about how you think the work does that, or the idea of the painting as a score.
Well,
I don't know,
the picture is
do you
a
do
score.
anything outside, literally do anything outside the painting in the...
But see, I don't think that's absolutely necessary, because what he does, I mean, what we just saw here, of course you could say, well, that's unfair because it's more than one painting. So I don't know exactly how to answer that objection. If you want to make it, we could talk about it at length, though. But what he is doing is he's taking a picture, a motif, as a kind of score and playing it, performing it in several different versions, the way you would, perform either a Fluxus score if you want, or a score for Bach. There's Glenn Gould and there's whoever else. And so I think, in that sense, I think encoded in this picture is the sense that a picture from elsewhere is being taken as a space itself that is become the locus of this whole kind of other imaginary thing. So
it's to do with the relationship to the found sources
yeah,
as well.
but specifically, I mean, I've gotten really interested in how people, Pierre Weeks has said this for a long time, that how can a film be thought of as a public space, and how, not just in spectatorship, but the film itself. And but I think a lot of artists who aren't associated with that kind of practice, a lot of painters, for instance, really are trying to think, well, how can a photograph become a public object in a different way, other than appearing on the cover of the front page of the New York Times or something, in that clear way that photographs are a public space. Mark, did you have?
Yeah, Thomas, I was interested in the way you were talking a lot about the way you look at art historical sources, paintings, or maybe magazines, or other kinds of images for the figure groupings. and the settings and kind of architectural spaces, but you haven't said so much about those parts of the work. And we've talked a bit about colour, but I'd like to know a little more about your thinking about paint handling, gesture, drips, washes, because of course there's a lot to say about those which aren't just to do with processes, but historically they've been thought of as sometimes the abstract expressionism, like gizmo gesture or light gesture.
So I want to say, it becomes even more of a question, and you'll see if you come to see my show tomorrow, you'll see that I seem to control a lot of what's going on in the painting, and to some extent that's true, I do. But there is also very much a manifestation of trying to undo this level of control, and that's more in previous work, but also in that work. I work a lot with acrylic. Already the acrylic does never do exactly what you want it to do, because it's never really quite coherent, sort of. And there is always an element of, that's how painters talk, and I talk like them now too, but there's always, and you wish for that moment that exudes the control, that kind of is the productive mistake that you're looking for. It mostly is born out of sheer desperation because you run out of plans, And that sort of thing plays a big role. I see possibilities in the acrylic, but I also work a lot with oil on top of acrylic, and there's different ways to do it. In the beginning, the painting will be very open often, and sometimes I go with that. And there was a version of the Friday's Child that is totally open, where the figure is just a palimpsestical tracing of, where it kind of seems to want to be at the moment, and there's a lot of that in the work anyway, I make my own color. It's just something that I think about when I think about my studio, how does it look like and stuff, I have tons of pigments around, and I make my own acrylics because they have a different type of luminosity in a way, and I have a different feel for it, But is that answering?
Yeah. Also, since I don't know how long you've lived in New York, but has the history of sort of mid-century New York painting become more important?
Only because my friends tell me that, I'm friends with Amy Silman or other people who have a different relationship to abstract expressionism. She also claims to never really think about it. I don't really quite believe that, but I certainly do to some extent, but it has to serve a purpose, I want to disrupt the space, and when you look at the work, and also, like as in Friday's Child, it seems to be, in part at least, a three-dimensional space, and then there have to be ways to disrupt the picture plane, just rather than keeping it coherent, sort of. Like, as if that was, again, that's the affirmative, the trap of the affirmation, would be to have this coherent space. So I need to disrupt it, and that will take on the form of almost a quote of an abstract expressionist painting, if you want. And I am aware of that, but it's not as if I wanted to say something using that in particular. I wouldn't say that, it's painting history and I use it. Okay, but it doesn't try to have a specific point about a quote in a way, or it's not going to be a concrete reference. I'm not referencing de Kooning or something. I'm not doing that. I think it's just not, it's like, you could also say, is that a Richterian gesture, or what is it, it's at this point painting history, and I just use that,
Do we have time for one more? Or if there is one more? Is anyone? Yes.
You talk about disrupting space. When you're working, do you disrupt space more?
Yeah, it's really the opposite, I really don't know anything at all.
Right.
And I just try things.
Yeah.
And then I tried that and I just think like, oh God, that doesn't work because it's chaos maybe, or something that I can't quite get a hold on. And slowly there emerges an idea of what this could be like. And then I'm very often wrong nonetheless, because any type of preconceived idea about how the painting should look like. That is just something that doesn't work at all, and I wouldn't be curious about doing it, and that doesn't interest me. The work process is necessarily one that is very open to all solutions, and the best solution is certainly the one that I couldn't imagine beforehand. And it's always very satisfying if something works out and was just something that I couldn't think of at all, you know. And actually, I wouldn't do it if I could think of it beforehand. The painting is, of course, always smarter than I am, for sure, you know.